From winning the Carabao Cup,
he's going to share the duties with Kieran Trippier,
to being in the bottom half of the table.
I mean, look at it, Simon. The defeat to Arsenal means Newcastle have now lost 9 games in 12 and 4 in a row.
From playing in big Champions League nights, to not even getting European football. From spending a ton of money on new players to already wanting them gone. What the hell happened with Newcastle? To understand why things are going wrong now, you have to look at how good Newcastle United were before. Because in the 2024-2025 season, they looked like a completely different team. They were flying, winning games against everyone and doing it in style. They went on a run of 9 straight wins, matching a club record. That 2-legged win over Arsenal in the Carabao Cup semi-final, a masterclass from Eddie Howe. They finished 5th in the Premier League with 66 points and proved they could compete with the top teams. But the real highlight came in the Carabao Cup. On March 16th, 2025, Newcastle finally ended a 56-year trophy drought. It's like losing your virginity. They beat Liverpool 2-1 in the final at Wembley. Goals from Dan Burn and Alexander Isak sealed it in front of over 88,000 fans. That moment meant everything. They had just won a trophy, and it felt like proof that Newcastle had officially arrived as a serious team in English football. Because their run to that final was impressive. They knocked out Nottingham Forest, Chelsea, Brentford, and Arsenal along the way. The team had everything. They worked hard, played with intensity, and attacked quickly. Players like Bruno Guimaraes, Isak, and Anthony Gordon were incredible. Isak especially was on another level. He scored 27 goals in all competitions, 23 of them coming in the league. Only Haaland and Salah had scored more. At that point, Newcastle looked like one of the best rising sides in Europe. Now though, it's the complete opposite. They had lost 5 games in a row in all competitions at one point. In 2026 alone, they lost 9 of 15 league games. I mean, that's as bad as teams fighting relegation. This season has been a nightmare, and it actually makes sense when you look at it just based on how the season started. From the get-go, the Magpies had to deal with their biggest star wanting to leave.
Isak is Liverpool's new number 9. They've confirmed it officially now. He has signed in a British record transfer of £125 million.
There had been rumors about Isak going to Liverpool for months, but many assumed that due to the Swedish striker being under contract, how well Newcastle were doing, and how much it would cost, that these were just rumors. But then, this man came out and publicly said he wanted to explore his options. He sounds like my buddy when we visited Bangkok together. I think he was talking about different options though. Isak's comments left the entire Newcastle project at a bit of a crossroad. He still had 3 years left on his contract, but now there was a real chance that he would leave in the summer. Liverpool had already made a big move, offering £110 million for him. Newcastle shut that down fast. They said, nope, not for sale, buddy. But then Isak started to go on strike, essentially forcing Newcastle to sell him.
Alexander Isak has released a statement on Instagram, and this is what it says.
Liverpool ended up making a bid for £125 million, and these guys finally decided to accept. I mean, that's a crazy amount of money. And boom, just like that, their best player was gone. And the way that he left put a sour taste in the mouth of all Newcastle fans that had supported him. So now Newcastle had a ton of money, but they needed to bring in players that could replicate the output that Isak had provided. Up until that point though, their transfer window had been like me on Tinder, swiping right on everyone, but being left on scene. They were interested in the likes of Cunha, but he picked United. They were interested in Mbumo, same result. They wanted Šeško, and the pattern continued. They were aiming high, shopping for top players that could come in and immediately help them both in the Premier League and the Champions League. But the problem was that every time they went after these elite players, they ended up losing out, and that's because the competition was brutal. There are not many world-class players out there, and when they were available, every big club was chasing them. Those big clubs could offer more money, had a more famous name, and came with that big club reputation. Newcastle fans, don't get mad at me, I know you are a big club, I've liked you since I watched the first Goal movie. But in the eyes of many of these players, they are still drawn to cities like Manchester and London. It got so bad that people were calling Newcastle Rejection FC, because every big name linked with them seemed to end up somewhere else. They were literally making graphics of the players they didn't sign. Now fortunately for Newcastle, by the end of the transfer window, they ended up signing a bunch of players. They ended the summer spending a record £241 million on 5 permanent signings. That's actually the most they've ever spent in one window. They smashed their transfer record with a £69 million move for Nick Voltemada. They also picked up Wissa, Elanga, Malik Chow, and Jacob Ramsey. On paper, it looked like a big upgrade for the squad. They had more depth and more options. But in reality, things didn't go smoothly at all. all. Isak, for example, joined late because he was pulling an Isak at Brentford. Then when he got there, he was injured almost immediately while playing for his national team. That meant he couldn't build any rhythm with the squad early on. Only Anthony Elanga had a full preseason with the team, so most of the new players were already behind before the season even started. The bigger issue was also behind the scenes. The club didn't have a proper chief executive or sporting director during a key part of the transfer window. Because of that, the signings felt rushed and unplanned. Even with all that chaos, somehow the season didn't start that badly for Newcastle United. They showed fight in September and hit some good form in October of 2025. For a bit of time, they looked like the same team that finished 5th the season before. They picked up solid wins against Nottingham Forest and Fulham, and also knocked out Tottenham out of the Carabao Cup. Though beating Tottenham, who hasn't done that this season? In Europe, things looked even better. They smashed Union Saint-Gilloise 4-0 away from home, and beat Benfica 3-0 at St. James's Park. So some big performances. For a few weeks, it felt like everything was coming together. The new players looked like they were settling in, and Eddie Howe's high-intensity style was still working perfectly. By the end of October, Newcastle were in a strong position in both the league and the Champions League. You even had Voltemada, who had hit the ground running.
Willock, dinged cross, Voltemada!
And was performing way better than Isak was for Liverpool. He scored against Wolves in his first Premier League game, then scored 3 goals in a row against Arsenal, Forest, and Brighton. Now Newcastle did lose 2 of those 3 games, but the German had made quite a good first impression. Around November and December though, the season took a sharp turn. The main reason was injuries. At one point they had about 8 players out at the same time. No team can deal with that easily. Newcastle's whole identity is based on intensity. They press hard, run a lot, and play at a high tempo. That only works when the players are fresh, but when you're playing twice a week in multiple competitions, it catches up to you. Since these guys were competing on 4 fronts, the schedule became too much. Instead of training properly, most sessions turned into recovery work just to keep the players fit. The injuries also hit the worst possible areas. Defensively, key players like Dan Burn, Livramento, and Kieran Trippier were all out at the same time in December. In the midfield, you could see the fatigue. Sandro Tonali started the season strong, but even his level dropped as the games piled up. And you want to know what's the biggest sign that things were going wrong? These guys stopped closing out games. By Christmas, Newcastle had already dropped 13 points from winning positions. This was a team that used to control matches and then finish them off. Now they were letting easy games slip away. As the season went on, another issue started to show. Eddie Howe's tactics weren't working. Newcastle stuck with the same 4-3-3 system, and over time, it became predictable. What used to surprise teams at the start now felt easy to read. At first, Newcastle's high press was a huge weapon. They would press aggressively, win the ball high, and attack quickly. But by 2026, top teams had figured it out. They started playing around the press instead of through it, and once they broke that first line, there was a lot of space to attack. Defenders like Dan Burn and Cher are not the quickest, so when the press failed, they struggled to deal with the space behind them, especially out wide. Teams kept exploiting that gap between the defense and the midfield, and Newcastle kept getting caught. This led to a lot of easy goals conceded and just some messy performances at the back. By April, Newcastle had only kept 5 clean sheets in 36 games. They had less clean sheets than Bonnie Blue. That's a huge drop compared to the season before, when they were one of the most solid defensive teams in the league. Another big issue was how Eddie Howe used the players. Best example is Nick Voltemada. This guy is at his best up front, finding space and creating chances. That's where he was playing when he was getting goals for fun in the beginning of the season. He can also do really well as a number 10/center forward, playing off of someone else. But instead, Eddie Howe pushed this guy deeper into midfield, playing almost like an 8 in a 4-3-3. It just didn't suit him. This is where the criticism of Howe really started to grow. He didn't change the system, he stuck with the same setup even when it clearly wasn't working. Meanwhile, teams like Manchester City and Arsenal were constantly adjusting, rotating players, tweaking tactics, managing fatigue. Newcastle didn't do any of that. They kept playing the same intense style, even when the players were clearly exhausted. They would start out strong, dominate the first half, and look in control. But as the game went on, they would just run out of energy. Second halves became a problem. The perfect example of this can be seen in their performance versus Barca. After a solid 1-1 draw in the first leg, Newcastle went to face Barca away from home. There was a real belief that they can make it to the quarterfinals, which makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider Barca's track record in the Champions League. Instead though, that second leg turned into an absolute nightmare. They lost 7-2 on the night and 8-3 on aggregate. It was one of the worst results ever for an English team in the Champions League. You see, Newcastle were actually good in the first half. It was open, chaotic, and full of chances. This is classic Barca. Their backline is higher than Snoop Dogg. That's what allowed Anthony Elanga to score twice to keep things level at 2-2. Keep in mind, Elanga was not having a great season before this, but thanks to him, Newcastle were right in the game. But just before halftime, everything shifted. Yamal scored a penalty in stoppage time to make it 3-2 to Barcelona. That goal completely changed the momentum. After the break, Newcastle just couldn't keep up. The gaps between the two teams became obvious. Barca were sharper, quicker, and way more organized. Newcastle looked tired and lost. The game showed the gap between Newcastle and Europe's elite, and after that night, it felt like the team was mentally and physically drained heading into the final stretch of the season, because just a few days later, they lost the derby 2-1 to Sunderland. That loss alone hurt, but it got worse when you remember that they had already lost to Sunderland earlier in the season as well, in a game decided by a strange own goal from Nick Voltemada. Losing twice to Sunderland in one season hadn't happened in years. For Newcastle fans, this was the breaking point. Unfortunately for them, things got even worse in April. Newcastle played 3 important matches and didn't pick up a single point. Against Crystal Palace, they lost 2-1 after dropping 2 deep and inviting pressure while leading. At home against Bournemouth, they lost 2-1 as well. Defensive mistakes and another late goal killed them. By that point, they had already conceded 19 late goals during the season. Then against Arsenal, they actually played better, but still lost 1-0. Back in October, these guys were pushing for Europe. Now they're just trying to finish in the top half of the table. They're nowhere near the levels people thought they had reached. Right now, they are a team stuck between what they were and what they're supposed to become. And until they can figure that out, the pressure is only going to keep growing. To see just how good this team used to be, you have to watch this video right here.